My boyfriend told me his phone data was acting weird. The same week, our shared budgeting app flagged a $340 charge at a hotel 40 minutes from our apartment on a Tuesday afternoon when he'd told me he was at a client meeting. I didn't say anything for 11 days. Then I found the account he'd been using to talk to her. This is still waters. Here's what she wrote. I'm Sasha, 29. My boyfriend Callum and I have been together 3 years, living together for the last 14 months, and we use a shared expense app, Ledger, one of the split tracking apps everyone's boyfriend suggests at some point, mostly for rent and groceries, sometimes for bigger joint purchases. Neither of us thought of it as a monitoring tool. It just happened to log dates, times, and locations alongside every charge, which is the entire reason this story exists. We moved in together faster than either of our families thought was wise, about 18 months into the relationship, mostly for practical reasons. My lease was ending, his roommate was moving out of state, and the math of 2 rents versus 1 made an obvious case neither of us fought very hard against. Looking back, I think we skipped some of the slower groundwork other couples build before combining their whole lives, financial and otherwise, and some of what happened later might have surfaced earlier if we'd taken more time before merging bank habits, calendars, and everything else that comes with an address. The $340 charge showed up on a Tuesday in March, tagged automatically by the app's location feature as a hotel I'd never heard of, 40 minutes outside the city. Callum had told me that morning he had a late client meeting and might grab a hotel gym session afterward to reset before a big presentation the next day. A thing he'd done maybe twice before, always alone, always explained in advance. This time the charge was $340, well above what a gym day pass would run, and it came through on a joint card meant for household expenses, not his personal spending. Callum works in commercial insurance, long hours some weeks, genuinely stressful ones, and the hotel gym habit had started, originally, as a real coping mechanism after a rough stretch at work the year before. Pool, sauna, an hour of quiet before coming home to whatever the evening needed from him. I'd actually encouraged it at the time, glad he'd found something that helped. That history is part of why the first charge didn't alarm me the way it maybe should have. It fit a pattern I already believed in. I asked him about it that night, casually. The way you ask about something you're 80% sure has an explanation. He said the hotel had messed up the charge, that he was getting it reversed, that it was a whole annoying thing with their billing system. I let it go. 3 weeks later, a second charge appeared. Same hotel, $290, tagged to a Thursday when he'd told me he was staying late at the office. I didn't say anything about the second charge either. I just started a log. Not obsessive, just dates, next to what he'd told me he was doing that day, next to what the app showed. Within 5 weeks, I had 4 mismatches between his stated location and a charge at that same hotel. There was a 5th charge in that window too, smaller, $60, at a bookstore cafe near the same hotel. On a Saturday, I'd been told he was at his own father's place, helping move furniture. That one bothered me more than the bigger charges somehow. Maybe because it was so mundane. Coffee and a pastry. The kind of receipt that wouldn't raise anyone's suspicion on its own. Sitting there in a log that was quietly building into something I didn't want it to be. The account I found wasn't hidden particularly well, which almost made it worse. Callum used our shared laptop for work sometimes, and one evening, looking for a tax document in our joint cloud drive, I saw an app icon I didn't recognize, logged in, still signed in from earlier that day. It was a messaging app, a second one, separate from the one we both used with each other and with everyone we knew. The account name was C. Reyes. His middle name is Reyes. Underneath it, a conversation with a contact saved as I. My hands were actually shaking by the time I opened it, which surprised me, because some part of me had already half known what I was going to find before I clicked. There's a strange, specific quiet that happens in a room when you're about to confirm something you've spent weeks not letting yourself think directly. I remember the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, Callum's keys still by the door from when he'd gotten home 20 minutes earlier, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening running underneath what I was about to learn was not an ordinary evening at all. I read 4 months of it in one sitting, sick to my stomach the entire time, telling myself I'd stop and not stopping. I was Ivy, his ex-girlfriend from before we met, someone he'd described to me early in our relationship as not a big deal. We ended things mutually. We're not in touch. They'd reconnected 9 months earlier, quietly, first just messages, then the hotel, twice, both times logged as charges on our shared card because Callum had apparently forgotten, or hadn't cared, that Ledger tracked location on every transaction, regardless of which app you thought you were hiding behind. Nothing in the messages confirmed anything physical happened between them beyond the 2 hotel visits, and that distinction mattered to how I handled what came next. But the emotional content was its own kind of betrayal on its own terms. Him telling Ivy things about our relationship he'd never told me directly, complaining about small things I did that he'd never once raised with me, telling her 3 weeks before our anniversary that he didn't know what he wanted anymore. One message, from the week of the bookstore cafe charge, described an entire Saturday afternoon in a level of warm, specific detail he'd never once given me about any afternoon we'd actually spent together recently. What she'd ordered, a joke she'd made about the barista, how easy it felt talking to her compared to how exhausting things had become at home. Reading that particular message was worse, in some ways, than the hotel charges, because it wasn't secretive about physical contact. It was casually, comfortably intimate in a way that suggested he'd stopped thinking of it as cheating at all. More like a second, easier version of a life he already had. I read the earliest messages too, the ones from 9 months back, and they told a story I hadn't expected. Not a dramatic reunion, but a slow, almost accidental drift. Ivy had messaged him first, a birthday well-wish that turned into a longer conversation, then a weekly check-in, then daily. Callum's early replies were careful, almost formal, the kind of tone you'd use with someone you were deliberately keeping at a professional distance. That tone eroded gradually, message by message, until by month 4 he was telling her things about his day before he told me, and by month 6 he'd stopped mentioning her existence to me at all, not through any single decision I could point to, just an accumulation of smaller ones. There was a stretch in the messages, around month 5, where he'd actually written to a different friend, not Ivy, someone from work, admitting he felt guilty about how much he looked forward to hearing from her, and that friend had told him, casually, as long as nothing's happening, it's not really cheating. Everyone needs an outlet. I don't know that friend, and I probably never will, but reading that exchange made me angrier than almost anything else in the whole account. The idea that someone had given him permission, in writing, to keep doing exactly what he was already doing, dressed up as harmless. I gave myself 2 days before saying anything, mostly because I didn't trust what would come out of my mouth in the first hour. When I finally did, I didn't lead with accusation. I sat him down and told him I knew about the account, the hotel charges, and Ivy, and asked him to just tell me the truth about what this actually was before I decided what came next. He didn't deny it once I said her name. I think some part of him had been waiting to get caught, the way people sometimes leave a trail without fully admitting to themselves that's what they're doing. He said it started as just talking, that Ivy had reached out during a rough stretch at his job, that it became something he looked forward to in a way that scared him, and that the hotel visits were not what I think, which he clarified, when I pushed, meant they'd talked for hours and slept in separate beds. Twice. Which I chose to believe because the messages themselves didn't contradict it, even though the secrecy made trusting anything he said feel almost beside the point. I asked him the question that had been sitting under everything else since I'd read those messages. Why Ivy, specifically, and why now? 3 years into a relationship he'd never once, as far as I knew, seemed unhappy in. He was quiet for a long time before answering, and when he did, it wasn't the answer I expected. He said being around Ivy didn't require anything of him. No shared bills, no future to plan, no version of himself he had to keep being consistent for. With me, he said, everything felt like it mattered. Every conversation had weight, and some nights that weight felt like more than he knew how to carry. So he'd found somewhere it didn't. I told him that explanation didn't excuse the hotel or the secrecy, but it did tell me something true about what had actually been missing, and it wasn't really about Ivy at all. It was about him never once telling me, in 3 years, that the weight of an actual adult relationship sometimes scared him. I asked why that conversation had never happened with me instead of happening, slowly, with someone else entirely. He didn't have a clean answer for that either, just that it had felt easier to disappear into something with no stakes than to admit, out loud, to the person those stakes belonged to, that he was struggling under them. What actually mattered to me wasn't really the physical question. It was that he'd built an entire separate emotional life with someone else, funded partly on our shared card, hidden behind an app I'd never have thought to check, while telling me repeatedly that everything between us was fine. I told him I needed 2 things before I could even decide whether us was still a question worth asking. First, full access, not surveillance going forward, but a complete, honest accounting of the relationship with Ivy. Every message, no more accounts I didn't know existed. Second, he needed to be the one to end contact with her, in writing, in a message I could see, not a private conversation I'd have to take his word for. He asked quietly whether I wanted to know everything or whether some details would only make it worse without changing anything practical. I told him I'd rather have the whole picture and decide for myself what to do with it than find out later there'd been a version of events he'd curated for my comfort. I'd already lived through discovering one hidden thing, and I wasn't interested in discovering a second one built specifically to spare my feelings about the first. He did both within 3 days, which surprised me. I'd expected more negotiation, more minimizing. The message to Ivy was short, said plainly that he'd been dishonest with both of us and needed to stop, and Ivy didn't respond, which told me something about how she'd understood the situation too. My sister, Priyanka, was the first person I told, 2 days after finding the account, before I'd even said anything to Callum. She didn't tell me what to do, which I appreciated more than advice would have helped in that moment. She just sat with me on the phone for an hour while I read parts of the messages out loud, occasionally saying, "Okay," or "I'm here," instead of the running commentary I think I would have given if our positions were reversed. Having someone just witness it with me, without immediately pushing me toward a decision, made the 2 days before I actually confronted him feel survivable instead of just endless. Reading the full account he sent me, every message, going back to the very first, "Hey, it's been a while," that started it 9 months earlier, was its own strange kind of closure. It confirmed the timeline I'd already pieced together, but it also showed me the moments where he'd almost stopped on his own. Twice. Telling Ivy he thought they should slow down, only to pick it back up within a week or two each time. That pattern told me something about what I was actually deciding whether to rebuild trust with. Not someone who'd planned a double life from the start, but someone who kept choosing the easier feeling over the harder, honest conversation, over and over, until a spreadsheet did the choosing for him instead. We're still together, for now, in a version of the relationship that looks different than it did 5 months ago. A shared calendar we actually both check. An agreement that either of us can ask about any charge, any account, any absence, without it being treated as an accusation. I don't know yet if that's enough to actually rebuild trust, or just enough to postpone deciding it's broken. I gave it 6 months before I revisit the question honestly, with myself, regardless of how good things feel in the meantime. I started seeing my own therapist around the same time, mostly to have somewhere to put the parts of this I didn't want to keep processing out loud with Priyanka, or with Callum himself. She asked me in one of the early sessions what I thought I actually wanted the outcome to be, and I remember not having a real answer. I wanted to know it wasn't going to happen again, more than I wanted a promise that it wouldn't, which are two very different things to actually get from another person. Callum started seeing a therapist on his own, without me asking him to, about a month after everything came out. Something he'd resisted for years, whenever I gently suggested it during earlier rough patches at work. I don't know exactly what changed his mind, whether it was guilt or genuine reflection or some mix of both, and I've tried not to need an answer to that question in order to let the change count for something. He mentioned once, almost offhand, that therapy had helped him understand why the easier, secret version of connection with Ivy had felt safer than an honest, difficult conversation with me. That it let him avoid disappointing anyone directly, including himself. What I do know is that the $340 charge on a shared budgeting app was never supposed to be a security system. It just turned out to be one anyway, because the truth doesn't need you to go looking for it. Sometimes it just sits there in a spreadsheet, waiting for you to actually read it. I deleted my own copy of the messaging app a while ago, the one I'd used to read 4 months of his conversation with Ivy in a single 6 sitting. I don't need it anymore, and I noticed, once it was gone, that I'd been checking it far more often than was healthy for either of us in those first few weeks. Less out of any real new suspicion, and more because some part of me hadn't fully believed the worst part was actually over yet. Priyanka checks in every couple of weeks now, not intrusively, just a text asking how things are actually going. And I've noticed I tell her the truth more easily than I used to tell anyone the truth about anything hard. I think watching her sit quietly with me through the worst of it taught me what it actually looks like to be told something honest without flinching away from it. So here's what I keep wondering. How many relationships have a version of that spreadsheet sitting somewhere, unread, telling the truth nobody's asked it yet? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. That's the whole story. If this one stayed with you, subscribe to Still Waters. Thanks for listening.